Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I live in one of the most remote parts of West Virginia, tucked deep into the mountains where the nearest town is almost 40 minutes away, and the closest neighbor lives well beyond the tree line. My cabin sits at the end of an old gravel road that winds through miles of dense forest before finally reaching my property. There are no streetlights out there, no traffic, no sounds of civilization after dark. Most nights, the only things I hear are crickets, distant coyotes, and the wind moving through the trees. I moved there 3 years ago after burning out from city life. I had spent most of my 20s chasing business opportunities that never really went anywhere. Meanwhile, my older brother seemed to succeed at everything he touched. He owned a thriving construction company, had a nice house, and seemed to have his entire future mapped out. I wasn't jealous of him, but I couldn't help comparing my life to his. Moving into an isolated cabin in the mountains wasn't exactly where I imagined I'd end up at 31 years old. Still, I grew to love the solitude. The cabin wasn't much, but it was mine. It sat on nearly 20 acres of heavily wooded land, surrounded by steep hills and thick forest. Once the sun went down, the darkness outside became almost absolute. On moonless nights, you couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch. This happened late last November. A powerful storm system had rolled across the state that evening. The weather forecast had warned of heavy rain and strong winds. But forecasts rarely prepared you for what those storms actually felt like out there. By 10 o'clock, rain was hammering against the roof so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown from the sky. The trees surrounding the cabin swayed violently with each gust, and every so often a flash of lightning would briefly illuminate the forest before plunging everything back into darkness. I had spent most of the evening sitting in my living room with a blanket, watching an old movie and listening to the storm rage outside. There was something comforting about being warm and dry while nature lost its mind around you. Shortly after midnight, the power went out. The television clicked off instantly, leaving me in complete darkness. I sighed, grabbed my phone from the coffee table, and turned on the flashlight. Power outages weren't uncommon where I lived. Usually they lasted a few hours before crews managed to restore service. I wasn't particularly worried. I figured I'd head to bed and deal with it in the morning. But about 10 minutes later, while I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I heard a loud metallic bang somewhere outside. At first, I assumed something had blown into the side of the cabin. During storms like that, fallen branches were common. I was worried that once again there might be damage done to my cabin, but I wasn't scared until I heard it again. This time, it sounded deliberate. I turned off the faucet and listened. The storm continued howling outside, but beneath it I heard something else. There was a rhythm in the noise, but with everything that was happening, I couldn't clearly make out exactly what it was. It seemed to be coming from outside, and from the front of the cabin, maybe from the porch. I moved closer to the window, and as I did, a horrible feeling came over me. I think what I was hearing were someone's footsteps, but nobody should have been out there. The nearest gas station was over 20 miles away, and almost nobody even knew where my property was located. I slowly walked toward the front window and carefully pulled back the curtain. At first, I saw nothing except rain. Then lightning flashed. For less than a second, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my porch. The moment darkness returned, the figure was gone. I immediately stepped away from the window. My heart was pounding really fast now. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone's vehicle had broken down on the road. Maybe they needed help. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something felt wrong. People who need help knock on the door. They don't stand silently outside your house in the middle of a storm. I quietly locked the bedroom door and checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual during bad weather, but it was enough to make my stomach drop a bit. Then I heard something that completely erased any doubt that I was in danger. The sound of a door being crushed, then footsteps from inside my cabin. I stood completely still, partly because I was in absolute panic and my body refused to react. And for a few seconds, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then came the unmistakable sound of wet boots moving across the wooden floor. Someone had clearly entered my house. Actually, judging by the multiple sets of footsteps, several people had. I slowly grabbed the rifle I kept locked in a cabinet beside my bed. I wasn't looking for a confrontation, but I wasn't about to sit defenseless while strangers wandered through my home. The footsteps moved through the living room. Cabinets opened. Drawers slid out. They weren't being quiet. They acted like they knew nobody would stop them. Then I heard voices. It sounded like at least 3 men, maybe 4. Their words were muffled, but I could tell they were communicating with each other. One of them laughed, and that sound still makes my skin crawl. There was something deeply unsettling about how comfortable they seemed, as if they had done this before, as if they weren't worried about being caught. I carefully cracked open my bedroom door and looked down the hallway. The power outage had left the cabin pitch black, but occasional flashes of lightning lit up portions of the house through the windows. During one of those flashes, I saw them. 3 men wearing dark rain jackets. One carried a flashlight. Another appeared to be carrying a crowbar. The third was standing near my kitchen, looking directly toward the hallway. I instantly pulled the door shut. A second later, I heard footsteps moving in my direction. I didn't wait. The back of my cabin had a small utility door leading outside. I threw it open and ran into the storm. Rain hit me like a wall. The ground was already turning to mud beneath my boots. And it was hard to keep my balance between the absolute darkness and the uneven ground. I sprinted through the darkness toward an old logging trail that crossed my property. Branches slapped my face and water soaked my clothes within seconds. Several times I nearly fell down the steep hillside. Behind me, I could hear shouting. They had realized I was gone. For nearly 15 minutes, I ran through the woods with no real destination in mind. I just needed distance between myself and the cabin. Finally, after climbing onto higher ground, my phone picked up a weak signal, and I immediately called 911. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm while deputies were sent to the property, but it took almost 40 minutes for law enforcement to reach the area. That's the reality of living somewhere that remote. By the time they arrived, the intruders were gone. The front door had been forced open. Several firearms, cash, tools, and electronics had been stolen. The deputies believed the men had probably been watching the property for some time. They likely knew I lived alone and waited for the storm and power outage to provide cover. As you can imagine, I didn't go back to living in that cabin for months. My brother let me stay with him. But eventually, I had to return, and even today, I still live in this cabin. Most nights are peaceful, but whenever a storm rolls through the mountains and the power flickers, I find myself staring into the darkness beyond the windows, wondering whether someone might be standing out there again, watching from the trees. Meanwhile, I have a much safer cabin than I did back then. It's no longer so easy to break down the front door. I built a tunnel under the cabin that cost me a fortune, but it allows me to escape if someone breaks in, or to wait in a safe, impenetrable place until the police arrive. I hope nothing like that ever happens again, because once was traumatic enough. But if it does happen, they won't catch me unprepared. My name is Dean, and everything I'm about to tell you happened maybe around 7 years ago. It was easily the most traumatic period of my life, and honestly, I don't think I've managed to connect all the dots even now. I needed years before I could feel remotely comfortable living in these mountains again, and even today, I wouldn't say I'm completely at ease. There are still nights when I hear something outside, or catch myself staring into the woods longer than I should, and my mind goes right back to that time. For a little context, I grew up in West Virginia, and I've spent almost my entire life out here. Isolation was never something that bothered me because it's all I ever knew. My parents owned a huge piece of land that sat completely by itself. No nearby neighbors, no traffic, no kids my age running around. I pretty much grew up alone. I entertained myself with whatever I could find and didn't have much interaction with other people outside of my family. Because of that, I never developed any fear of being by myself or living somewhere remote. If anything, I became more comfortable with solitude than I ever was around crowds. The only time in my life that I really stepped away from that was when I turned 18. I went through a rebellious phase and convinced myself I needed to get out of West Virginia. To me, it felt like a place with nothing to offer someone my age, especially somebody who never went to college. I looked around and couldn't see opportunities, couldn't see a future, and honestly couldn't imagine myself staying there forever. So, I left and ended up in California. I lived there for about 3 years. Then I came back. I came back for 2 reasons. The first one sounds stupid unless you've spent your life in places like these. I was starting to feel suffocated by being around people all the time. I don't know how else to explain it. It was almost like the mountains were calling me back. I missed the quiet. I missed being able to step outside at night and hear absolutely nothing. I missed the feeling of space and the kind of peace that only comes from knowing you're completely alone. The second reason was much less poetic. I was broke. I quit my job because I was being completely taken advantage of, like a lot of people are these days. I couldn't take it anymore. I figured I'd find something else quickly, but that didn't happen. Before I knew it, I had burned through most of my savings and didn't have many options left. Moving back to West Virginia became less of a choice and more of a necessity. The funny thing is that I didn't even resent it. By that point, I already felt like I needed to come back anyway. My parents owned a cabin that they mostly used as a vacation place. They let me move in there instead of going back to live with them, which I appreciated more than I can explain. The cabin sat deep in the mountains, far enough away from everything that nights were genuinely dark, and the nearest neighbors might as well have been on another planet. And honestly, life was pretty good. Over the next 4 years, I built a comfortable routine for myself. I found a job that I actually didn't mind and that paid me well enough. I never had expensive tastes. My biggest expenses were maintaining the cabin and keeping up with the property. Out here, there honestly isn't much to spend money on anyway. I kept to myself, went to work, came home, and spent most evenings enjoying the peace and quiet. For 4 years, everything was fine. Then one night, I had an absolutely miserable day at work and found myself in one of those weird moods where you feel emotionally exhausted and start craving comfort food for no reason. I didn't really have anything at home, and I figured getting out of the cabin for a little while might help pull me out of whatever funk I had fallen into. There's a small gas station and convenience store about 15 minutes from my place. Because it's close to one of the main roads cutting through the mountains, it gets a surprising amount of traffic. The owner and his wife make homemade desserts that are ridiculously good, and for some reason, that's all I could think about that night. So I got in my truck and drove there. I knew the guy behind the counter pretty well by then, and we ended up chatting for a while. He asked how work was going, I complained about my day, and it was honestly just a completely normal conversation. Then another man walked in. He sat next to me and naturally joined the conversation. At first he seemed perfectly pleasant, one of those people who can talk to anyone within 5 minutes of meeting them. He was friendly, funny, and honestly pretty easy to talk to. I didn't get a bad feeling from him at all. If anything, I remember thinking he seemed interesting. Then at one point, he touched my arm. It wasn't anything aggressive. It just felt different. A little later, he said something that made it pretty clear he was flirting with me. I explained as politely as I could that I wasn't interested and that I didn't date men. I even told him I had a girlfriend, which wasn't true, but it seemed easier than potentially making things awkward. I wasn't offended or uncomfortable. I'm not remotely judgmental about that kind of thing. What happens between consenting adults is their business. And there are far bigger things to worry about in this country than who somebody happens to be attracted to. So I kept the whole thing as casual as possible. The problem was that he didn't really seem to understand what I was saying. Throughout the rest of the evening, he kept making comments that forced me to repeat myself more than once. I remember eventually laughing a little and saying something like, "Look, I really think you're interested in me. And honestly, I'm flattered, but I'm straight. I'm just not into guys." Again, I tried to keep the tone light. Eventually, I decided it was time to leave. Before I got up, he asked if he could have my phone number and maybe keep in touch. I have always been terrible at telling people no. It's seriously one of my biggest flaws. So, I hesitated, but still said yes. I also immediately decided there was no way I was giving him my actual number. I ended up giving him the number from an old phone I used to have years before, one that had long since been disconnected. If he ever tried calling it, there wouldn't be anyone on the other end. I made an excuse about needing to get home, told him maybe we'd grab coffee sometime, and left as quickly as I reasonably could. I never told him where I lived, never mentioned my cabin, never talked about the road I took home. Nothing. And this next part is important. The drive back to my cabin takes about 15 minutes and cuts through an incredibly isolated section of mountain road. There are no streetlights, no houses, nothing. If another vehicle had followed me, I would have seen it immediately. There simply isn't any way not to. That night, nobody followed me home. At least, That's what I believed. 4 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night because I heard something inside my house. At first, I honestly thought it was the neighborhood cat. There's this orange cat that hangs around my property all the time. I've tried more than once to bring him inside permanently because this area is full of predators. I live way out in the woods, the kind of place where hearing coyotes at night isn't unusual and where you occasionally see bear tracks near the edge of your property. I always felt bad for him being out there alone. I leave food and water outside every day, and in a weird way, I've kind of adopted him, even if he clearly doesn't see things that way. He'll come inside sometimes if the windows are open, wander around for a bit, and then leave again. The second he realizes he's trapped indoors, though, he completely panics until I open everything back up. So when I woke up to the noise that night, I didn't feel afraid. If anything, I was mildly annoyed. I figured he'd gotten inside again and knocked something over. I got out of bed with the sole intention of opening a window or a door so he could leave. Then I started walking downstairs. I remember being halfway down the staircase when I looked toward the living room and immediately froze. One of the windows was wide open, and there was a man climbing out of it. The second he saw me, he moved faster. He practically launched himself through the window, landed outside, and disappeared into the woods. I don't think I've ever gone from half asleep to fully awake that quickly in my entire life. I just stood there for several seconds. Nothing made sense. Since moving there, I'd never had anyone try to break into my house. I'd never been robbed. I'd never even had someone accidentally pull into my driveway because it's that isolated. You're tucked so deep into the mountains that people don't simply end up there by mistake. What terrified me wasn't losing property. It was the realization that someone had been inside my house while I was asleep. I turned on every light in the place, every single one. I checked every room, every closet, every window, every door. I expected to find something missing. My wallet, my laptop, my television, anything. Nothing was gone. I called the police immediately. They arrived, searched around the property, took my statement, and looked through the house. I remember telling them I was almost certain I had locked everything before going to bed because I'm obsessive about checking doors and windows at night. Still, I gave myself room to doubt it. Maybe I'd forgotten a window. Maybe I'd been distracted. Maybe I was remembering incorrectly. The officers told me to contact them if I realized anything had been stolen. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The real nightmare started the following night. It was around 1 in the morning. I'd been downstairs playing video games for a while because I couldn't relax enough to go to sleep. Eventually, I got tired, turned everything off, and headed upstairs. I pulled back my blankets, and there was a photograph lying on my bed. It was a picture of me sleeping. I knew instantly it had been taken the previous night. I was wearing the same t-shirt I'd slept in after making dinner. I'd accidentally spilled tomato sauce on it earlier that evening and had simply wiped it off with a paper towel because I was too lazy to change. I remember thinking I'd wash it in the morning. The stain was visible in the photograph. I cannot properly explain the feeling that went through my body. It was like every muscle suddenly stopped working. The man hadn't entered my house to steal anything. He had stood next to my bed while I slept. He had taken a picture of me, and then he had left it there for me to find. I don't even know how I didn't wake up. I didn't sleep that night. I called the police again and handed over the photograph. Given everything that had happened, they agreed to keep a patrol car occasionally checking the area during the overnight hours. For almost 2.5 months, nothing happened. Then I came home from work one afternoon and found another photograph taped to my front door. Again, it was a picture of me sleeping. I didn't know when it had been taken, but it seemed recent because I'd gotten a new haircut only a few weeks earlier. Written across the photograph were words asking if I had missed him. I felt this wave of cold run straight through me. I looked around the property. I looked toward the tree line. But there was nothing. I immediately went inside, locked everything, and called the police. That same day, I finally did what my father had been telling me to do for years. I bought security cameras. I installed them everywhere. I also changed every lock in the house because by then I had started wondering whether this person somehow had a key. There was never any sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no damaged doors, nothing. I started sleeping less and less. Days would go by and I'd convince myself it was over. Then another photograph would appear. Always me sleeping. Always recent. I can't properly describe how psychologically exhausting that became. I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every sound outside sent me to the windows. Friends started staying over because I couldn't stand being alone anymore. Nothing ever happened when someone else was there, only when I was by myself. And it was almost always after several sleepless nights, when I was so exhausted that I'd finally crash. What puzzled me the most was that I spent hours of my life watching the cameras, and not once did any of them capture someone on screen. In one of the recordings, I think I can see a shadow of someone walking at the edge of the frame, but I'm not completely sure. Eventually, I moved back in with my parents for a while because I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. Then I woke up there one morning and found another photograph of myself sleeping. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that, because at that point, it didn't matter where I went. Whoever this person was could find me anywhere. Eventually, I snapped. One night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I left something else in my bed under the blankets and pretended I had gone to sleep. I sat in the darkness and waited. I don't know how many hours passed, but then I saw him. He walked into my room as if he belonged there. I remember every hair on my body standing up. He didn't move like a burglar. He wasn't in a hurry and he wasn't nervous. He simply stood beside my bed and watched. Then he leaned over to take another picture and finally realized the thing in the bed wasn't me. He turned around and for the first time, I saw his face. I recognized him immediately. It was the man from the gas station. The man I'd met months earlier while buying dessert. The man I'd politely rejected. He looked furious and then he ran. Honestly, by then, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. That man had stolen months of my life. He'd made me afraid to sleep, afraid to be alone, afraid inside my own home. So I chased him outside. I caught up to him as he was climbing over my fence. I fired one shot and hit him in the foot. I had absolutely no intention of killing him. I wanted him to stop. I wanted him to know that I wasn't going to spend another night living in terror because of him. And apparently it worked. That was 7 years ago. I've never received another photograph. I've never found another note, and I've never seen him again. I still don't know who he really was. I don't know how he found my house, how he kept getting inside, or why he became so obsessively fixated on me after one brief interaction at a gas station. All I know is that a complete stranger managed to steal years of peace from my life. And even now, 7 years later, I still double-check my doors before going to bed. I still look at my bedroom window sometimes before turning off the lights. And every once in a while, when I wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, there's still this brief moment where I expect to find another photograph waiting for me.